Hi, Don Garbutt here from New Frontiers Audio. In this tutorial I'm going to show you how to set up sample and hold in Spektrumsynth. Sample and hold will provide a series of stepping values which will control parameters in your synth, typically filter cutoff points or the pitch of your audio oscillator, but it can actually control any controllable parameter. Measurements of an input signal are made by a steadily repeating LFO pulse wave. The hold part of sample and hold is that each value is held until the next clock pulse. The choice of input content and its frequency will have a heavy bearing on the results that we get from the sample and hold. If we choose noise as an input, we'll get a constantly random string of values. If we use a low-frequency oscillator as the input, then we'll get a string of values that seem to follow the pattern of the wave shape itself, essentially quantizing the waveform. Using sync settings for these LFOs enable repeating patterns. Variations of the frequencies of the two oscillators can come up with some very interesting patterns as well. These patterns can change steadily if the oscillators are not running in any kind of sync mode. Here's an example using the Arturia Moog Model V. In this case, the input to the sample and hold circuit is a sine wave. The sample and hold output is controlling the filter cutoff point. If we replace the sine wave with noise generator, in this case, I'm using Time Warp 2600 by Way Outwear. You'll hear that the pitch of oscillator number 1 will be controlled by the sample and hold values. In the ARP 2600, that's normal or internally wired. The square wave pulses of the sample and hold clock are also firing the envelope generator. You can hear that the sample and hold input is a very low-frequency triangle wave. This example is on the XILS Labs XILS3. The sample and hold input is a sawtooth wave, and each note restarts the LFO at the beginning of its cycle. With this setting, each key will start its own pattern of sample and hold. Okay, so now let's go to Spektrumsynth. There's a patch called Sample and Hold Initialization, Solo Oscillator 1 Pitch Control. The sample and hold controls are found in the Mono LFO stacked macro. Choices of clock source are made with this menu. The input choice that is sampled is controlled by your movements on this pad. First, I'll talk about the clock sources. The easiest one to use is the source called clock. Your sequencer has to be in play mode for the clock to function. A typical setting would be 1 bar and 16th note subdivision. Now with the LFO2 choice, let's take a look at LFO2, which is right here. It can run free or it can run sync to clock. At first it may seem that running LFO2 sync to clock is the same as running sync from clock, but the advantage is when using LFO2, you can use it to fire envelope generators by pressing the magic button. Clicking on the clock menu choice reveals the setup information in the info box in the upper left. Go to LFO2, make sure it's turned on, choose pulse wave, set the phase to 0, and set the symmetry anywhere from 0.9 to 0.99. This will turn the pulse wave into a very short spike, which will properly fire the sample and hold clock. Make sure you have the wheel value up, and that controls the amplitude of the LFO2, and you'll hear that everything's working. Let's just test out the clock choice here. The sequencer is stopped at the moment. Now I'm pressing play on the sequencer. And away we go. I've added 2 other optional clock sources that are actually key triggered. LFO2's phase is not key synced. The polyphonic LFOs from 9 to 16 are set up in that manner. This becomes very useful when you're running without the clock of your sequencer. Let's check that out. We have LFO9 and LFO10 as input clock sources. Choosing those sources disables the clock subdivision values. LFOs 9 and 10 are in the polyphonic LFO macro selection in the stacked macro over here. Choose LFO9 and turn it on. Set it to BPM, and set this to 24. A double click will do that. And set this to 1, which means that we'll have 1 cycle per quarter note. With the variable wave shape control, moving it to the far right will make a square wave. What's going on here is that the sample and hold will take place when the value of the square wave is at the top. So what we want to do here is only have it stay at the top for the briefest moment of time. So we can accomplish that by setting the pulse width to the far left. Syncing up the cycle of the square wave to the key on is done by pressing this button here. So we should be ready to go. So you can hear that the cycle starts with the key on. Setting this number to half of 24, or 12, will set it to run at eighth notes. And of course, setting it to 6 will set to 16th notes. All these settings are the same if you choose LFO 10. I included both so that you could possibly add one of these LFOs while the other one's already in use in your patch. Now let's take a look at the input mixer. This pad controls the choice of 3 inputs: LFO 13, LFO 8, and the noise generator. Left-right movements control the blend of LFO 13 and LFO 8. Vertical movement can mix in a little bit of noise into that blend. I set it up this way so that you could have LFO 13 playing and blend in a little bit of noise without having to go to the right and blending in LFO 8 in the process. So wherever you're positioned, you can just move vertically and add in a little bit of noise into the source. The source I've chosen first is LFO 13. Now as I move towards LFO 8, you'll begin to hear a long rising sawtooth. Let's mix in a little bit of noise with that. So we still hear the rising pattern with interjected random notes. Incidentally, I've got the quantized pitch input button down. That will adjust all the incoming modulation messages from Grand Central Station to semitones. I've also got the LFO 13 source key synced to the key trigger. That starts the sawtooth wave that's being sampled every time I press a key. I used pitch as a target so you could clearly hear the action going on from the sample and hold modulation source. It's really quite useful for a variety of targets. I'm going to assign the sample and hold to solo filter 1's cutoff point. If you want to scale back the values coming from sample and hold, press this button. This raises up the values somewhat and divides the range by 2. And you can usually scale things at the target. For instance, here's Grand Central controlling the cutoff point with the range knobs found in the target itself. Now let's check out the polyphonic nature of LFO 13. Notice that each key played starts its own independent cycle for the LFO. That's the beauty of the polyphonic low-frequency oscillator. So with this, we have a nice blend of key-synced independent LFO action from LFO 13, plus the relentless monophonic non-key triggered LFO 8. You can also modulate the XY value on that grid by assigning modulation sources to the targets in patches 13 to 16. I've set up an LFO to modulate the X value on the grid. I've set up the LFO 10 to switch back and forth every 2 beats. You can clearly hear the source of the sample and hold input switching back and forth. I'm using a slow LFO sawtooth wave and a faster LFO sawtooth wave. So you can hear that the first part of the pattern samples from the slow LFO and the second half of the pattern switches to the faster LFO. These rotary controls are the offsets for the incoming modulation of the X and the Y parameters. This is useful for shifting the effective modulation positioning. And finally, there's a lag control which can allow smoothing between the various output steps. The lag value is also modulatable. Lag modulation is found in patches 12 through 16. Well, that's it for the introduction to sample and hold. I hope you enjoyed this. In the next tutorial, I'll go through some of the presets that use sample and hold so you can hear the variety of activity that's possible. Those include sample and hold controlled wave shape selection in the wavetable section, random and pattern-based panning movements, pulse width modulation, filter blends, etc. I'm Don Garbutt. Thanks for watching.